Hello? Is this Mr. Daniel Russo? The voice on the other end of the line was small, hesitant, almost swallowed by the sound of wind rushing past the receiver. For a moment, Daniel Russo did not answer. He simply stared at the unknown number glowing on the screen of his phone, the faint reflection of the digits floating in the dark glass wall of the private meeting room. Daniel never answered unknown calls, but something about the pause on the line, the quiet breathing, the uncertainty made him lift the phone to his ear. "Yes," he said finally. Voice calm, controlled. The kind of voice that made grown men choose their words carefully. "Who is this?" A gust of wind cut across the receiver. Somewhere in the background, a siren wailed briefly, then faded. "My name is Nina," the woman said. She sounded young, tired, careful. I'm sorry to call you this late. I found this number on a medical tag around a woman's neck." Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly. Around him, 3 men in tailored suits continued discussing shipment routes, unaware that the world had just shifted by half an inch. "What woman?" Daniel asked. There was a pause, long enough for dread to begin forming. "She's lying on the sidewalk," Nina continued softly. "I think she fell. Maybe someone pushed her. Her bag was open. I don't know what happened." Daniel's hand tightened around the phone. "Is she conscious?" "No, sir." His chest tightened. I think this is your mother." Daniel stood so abruptly that his chair slid backward across the polished floor with a sharp scraping sound that silenced the room. 3 pairs of eyes turned toward him immediately. "What did you just say?" he asked quietly. "I'm on Tremont Avenue," Nina replied quickly, sensing the shift in his voice. "Near St. Agnes Pharmacy. She has a tag around her neck. It says Elena Russo. Emergency contact Daniel Russo. I already called 911. They said help is coming." Daniel did not say goodbye. He did not ask more questions. He simply ended the call, grabbed his coat, and walked toward the door. "Boss?" Carlo called after him. "What's going on?" Daniel paused only long enough to answer. "My mother's on the street." Outside, the rain had begun again. A thin, cold drizzle that turned the sidewalks into black mirrors, reflecting traffic lights and storefront signs. Daniel slid into the back seat of the waiting SUV, and the door shut with a heavy thud that seemed to separate him from the rest of the world. "Tremont Avenue," he told the driver. The car moved immediately. For several seconds, Daniel said nothing. He watched the blurred shapes of pedestrians pass by the window, umbrellas bent forward against the wind, heads lowered in the universal posture of people who had somewhere to be and no time to stop for anyone else. His mother hated that about the city. People used to look up, she would say. People used to see each other. Elena Russo had lived in the same Bronx neighborhood for 42 years. Even after Daniel became powerful enough to buy entire blocks, she refused to move downtown. She said she trusted the rhythm of her old streets more than the silence of luxury towers. "This is where I raised you," she would tell him. "If I leave, then what was the point of surviving it?" The SUV sped through Midtown, weaving between taxis and delivery trucks, tires hissing across wet pavement. Daniel leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on his knees, fingers clasped together so tightly the skin whitened across his knuckles. 9 minutes later, the SUV pulled sharply toward the curb where red and blue emergency lights flickered against the brick storefronts. A small crowd had gathered under the dim glow of a bus stop lamp, their faces lit by the cold pulse of ambulance lights. Daniel stepped out before the driver could open the door fully. Rain struck his face immediately. He saw the stretcher first, then he saw her. Elena Russo lay beneath a silver emergency blanket, her gray hair damp, her skin pale beneath the harsh streetlight. An oxygen mask covered her mouth, the plastic fogging faintly with each shallow breath. One of her shoes had fallen off and rested beside the curb. For a fraction of a second, Daniel did not recognize her. She looked smaller than he remembered, fragile in a way that frightened him. "That's my mother," he said, his voice rougher now. A paramedic nodded. "We're stabilizing her now. She has a pulse. Possible head trauma. We'll know more once we get her scanned." Daniel crouched beside the stretcher, his hand hovering above the blanket, uncertain whether touching her would help or make the moment more real. "Ma," he said quietly. No response. A movement nearby caught his attention. 5 feet away stood a woman in a worn Navy housekeeping uniform partially hidden beneath a thin rain jacket. The hem of her pants was dark with water. Her shoes were cheap canvas, soaked through from standing on the wet pavement too long. A canvas tote bag hung from her shoulder, the outline of cleaning supplies visible through the fabric. She looked exhausted, but she had not left. Her eyes met Daniel's. "I'm Nina," she said. Daniel stood slowly. "You called me." She nodded. Her hands were slightly red from the cold. She clutched a cracked phone like it was something she could not afford to lose. "I didn't want her to be alone," Nina said simply. The sentence struck him harder than anything else that night. Daniel reached instinctively into his coat, fingers brushing the edge of his wallet. Nina stepped back immediately. "I don't want money." He froze. Not because he was offended, because he was not used to hearing that. "You stayed with her," he said instead. Nina looked toward the stretcher, where paramedics were lifting Elena carefully into the ambulance. "She was breathing strange when I found her," Nina said. "Her bag was open. I think someone tried to take it. People walked past. I guess they thought she was drunk or homeless." Daniel followed her gaze. The idea that anyone could look at his mother and see nothing worth stopping for unsettled him more than the attack itself. "I tried to keep her warm," Nina added quietly. "I didn't know how long she'd been lying there." The wind blew her damp hair across her face. She brushed it back absently. "You should go home," Daniel said. She shook her head slightly. "The ambulance might need information." He studied her more closely now. 29, maybe. Intelligent eyes. No trace of performance or expectation. Just fatigue layered over quiet determination. "What do you do?" he asked. "Housekeeping," she replied. "Night shift sometimes. Today ran late." Daniel nodded once. The ambulance doors closed with a solid metallic sound. One of the paramedics looked at Nina. "You family?" "No," she said. The paramedic looked at Daniel. "She stayed with your mother the entire time. Didn't leave her side." Daniel glanced at Nina again. Rain continued falling, tracing slow lines down her jacket. "Come with us," he said. She hesitated. "I have work early. Just answer their questions," he said. Nina shifted her bag higher on her shoulder. "Okay." For a little while, that was the first moment Daniel noticed something unusual. He trusted her. He didn't know why. He didn't know anything about her. But he trusted that she had stayed when it would have been easier not to. And in his world, loyalty revealed itself in moments exactly like that. As Daniel stepped into the ambulance, he glanced back once more. Nina stood beneath the streetlight, shoulders slightly hunched against the rain, looking like someone the city had tried many times to overlook. But tonight, she had refused to overlook someone else. And though Daniel did not yet understand why, he felt certain of one thing. This call had changed more than the course of one night. The ambulance doors closed with a heavy metallic thud that sealed off the noise of the street and replaced it with the controlled urgency of medicine. Inside, the air smelled faintly of antiseptic, plastic tubing, and something metallic that always seemed to linger where fear and hope collided. The flashing lights outside painted the interior in alternating shades of blue and red, giving everything a strange, unreal rhythm. Daniel sat on the narrow bench beside the stretcher, one hand gripping the edge of the seat as the vehicle accelerated into the wet Manhattan night. Across from him, a paramedic adjusted the IV line connected to Elena Russo's arm, while another monitored the portable heart unit clipped to the rail. Beep. 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 The steady sound should have been reassuring, but Daniel had lived long enough to understand that survival was often fragile long before it became certain. Elena's skin looked thinner than he remembered, almost translucent beneath the harsh ambulance light. A faint bruise had already begun forming near her temple, the shadow of it spreading slowly like ink beneath paper. Her hair, once carefully pinned before she left the apartment that morning, now lay damp and disordered against the pillow. Daniel had always known she was aging. He had simply refused to imagine her vulnerable. "When did you find her?" the paramedic asked Nina, who sat opposite Daniel, her canvas bag resting between her feet. "Maybe 15 minutes before I called," Nina replied. "I was walking home from work. I saw her near the curb. At first I thought she was just resting, but she wasn't moving." You did the right thing calling emergency services first, the medic said. Nina nodded slightly but did not appear interested in praise. Daniel noticed the faint tremor in her hands now that the immediate crisis had shifted into controlled motion. The adrenaline was leaving her system. Fatigue was taking its place. Did she say anything? Daniel asked quietly. Nina shook her head. She was unconscious when I found her. Her breathing sounded shallow. I tried to keep her warm with my jacket. Daniel looked down and realized the thin emergency blanket covering Elena was not hospital-issued. Beneath it, he recognized the dark fabric of a coat far too light for the weather. You gave her your coat, he said. It was cold, Nina replied simply. Daniel did not respond immediately. The gesture was small, but in his world, small gestures often revealed the truth about people faster than long speeches ever could. The ambulance swerved left, tires hissing across rain-slick pavement. Through the rear window, city lights blurred into streaks of gold and white. Daniel's phone vibrated in his pocket again and again, but he ignored it. Whoever was calling could wait. The only timeline that mattered now was the fragile one, measured by the steady rhythm of the heart monitor. Does she live alone? Nina asked carefully, her voice softer now that the urgency of the call had passed. Yes, Daniel replied. She shouldn't, Nina said without accusation, simply stating what seemed obvious to her. Daniel allowed himself a faint breath that was almost a humorless laugh. She refuses to move. Some people don't leave places that made them strong, Nina said. Daniel studied her expression. There was no challenge in her tone, no judgment. Only observation. You from the Bronx? He asked. Born there, she said. Still there. The paramedic glanced between them briefly before returning his attention to the monitor. Daniel leaned back slightly, the leather seat creaking softly beneath his weight. For years he had measured people by what they wanted from him. Most wanted money. Some wanted influence. Others wanted proximity to power. Nina had asked for nothing. That made her difficult to categorize. What kind of work do you do? He asked. Housekeeping, she replied. Private residences mostly. Offices sometimes. You work late. Late work pays more. Daniel nodded slowly. That answer required no elaboration. He remembered nights when he had taken any job available, simply because it existed. Nights when sleep mattered less than opportunity. A sudden movement from Elena drew his attention. Her fingers twitched weakly beneath the blanket. Ma? Daniel leaned forward immediately. The paramedic checked the monitor. Reflex response. Could be a good sign. Daniel watched her face closely, searching for any sign of recognition, any small shift that would confirm she was still fighting her way back to consciousness. Nothing yet. Nina observed quietly from across the narrow space, careful not to intrude on the moment. She wears that tag all the time? Nina asked. Yes, Daniel said. She must trust you. The words lingered in the air between them. Daniel did not answer immediately. Trust was complicated in his life. People trusted him with money, with secrets, with decisions that shaped futures. But trust built on love carried a different weight entirely. My mother believes preparation is a form of respect, Daniel said after a moment. Nina considered that. My grandmother used to say preparation is how poor people survive, she replied. Daniel nodded slightly. The ambulance slowed as it approached the emergency entrance of Mount Sinai. Bright fluorescent light spilled across the wet pavement as the rear doors opened. The sudden noise of hospital activity replaced the contained quiet of the vehicle. Nurses moved quickly, guiding the stretcher toward the sliding doors. The wheels rattled across metal grooves in the pavement before rolling smoothly across polished tile floors. Daniel followed closely, his gaze fixed on Elena as the medical team moved her through the hallway with practiced efficiency. Possible cranial trauma, one doctor said. Prepare imaging. Vitals stabilizing, another replied. The language of emergency medicine sounded strangely similar to the language of crisis management Daniel had used for years, concise, controlled, focused entirely on outcomes. Nina remained near the wall, unsure whether to follow further. She watched as Elena disappeared behind double doors marked IMAGing. For the first time since the call, the immediate urgency paused. Daniel turned back toward Nina. You should sit, he said. She hesitated. I don't want to be in the way. You aren't, he replied. She sat in one of the molded plastic chairs along the wall, her bag resting on her lap. The hospital lighting revealed details the rain had concealed earlier. Faint detergent marks on her sleeve, a small tear near the seam of her pocket, exhaustion beneath her composure. "How far is your home?" Daniel asked. 20 minutes walking, she said. "Maybe less if the trains are running on time." "They rarely are." A faint smile appeared briefly at the corner of her mouth. A nurse approached, holding a clipboard. "You're the one who called emergency services?" the nurse asked Nina. "Yes." "We'll need a short statement." Nina nodded and stood, answering questions calmly, describing the position Elena had been found in, the open handbag, the absence of witnesses willing to stop. Daniel listened from a distance. Every detail felt personal. Every detail felt like evidence of something he had failed to prevent. When the nurse finished, Nina glanced toward the hallway where Elena had disappeared. "I should probably go," she said quietly. Daniel considered that. "You've done enough already," he replied. Nina adjusted the strap of her bag. "I hope she's all right." "So do I." She nodded politely and turned toward the exit. Daniel watched her walk across the waiting room floor, her footsteps quiet, her posture still carrying the weight of a long day's labor. Just before she reached the door, he spoke again. "Nina." She turned. "Thank you," he said. She studied him briefly, as if deciding whether the words were genuine. Then she gave a small nod. "You're welcome, Mr. Russo." The automatic doors opened, letting in a gust of cold air and the distant hum of traffic. Daniel remained standing long after she disappeared into the night. Somewhere beyond the walls of the hospital, the city continued moving without pause. But something had shifted. A stranger had stayed. And now, Daniel Russo found himself wondering why that mattered more than he expected. If this moment touched something in your heart, take a second to tell us where you're listening from. Stories like this remind us that even in a world driven by power and urgency, quiet acts of kindness still shape who we become. Share your thoughts in the comments, let us know your city, and join a community that believes compassion still matters. If this story moved you, please like the video and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next journey where courage, truth, and humanity find their way back into the light. The waiting room outside the imaging department was unusually quiet for a New York hospital. The late hour had thinned the crowd, leaving only the low hum of fluorescent lights and the distant rolling of medical carts somewhere deeper in the corridor. Daniel sat alone in one of the molded plastic chairs, elbows resting on his knees, hands loosely clasped, his gaze fixed on the set of double doors through which his mother had disappeared nearly 20 minutes earlier. Hospitals had their own sense of time. Minutes did not pass normally inside them. They stretched. They bent. They carried weight. Daniel checked his watch even though he had already memorized the exact second the doors had closed. 12 minutes. 12 minutes since the stretcher vanished into the white corridor. 12 minutes since control had slipped beyond his reach. His phone vibrated again, in his coat pocket. This time he pulled it out, glanced at the screen, and silenced the call without answering. 3 missed calls from Carlo. 2 from a number belonging to his attorney. 1 from an unfamiliar contact in Albany. News traveled fast in Daniel's world. Faster than truth, sometimes. He slid the phone face down on the chair beside him. For years, he had believed that anticipation was weakness. Waiting meant dependence on outcomes he could not guarantee. Waiting meant acknowledging that something important existed outside his influence. Tonight, he had no choice. Across the waiting room, a television mounted in the corner played a muted late-night news segment. Captions scrolling beneath images of city traffic and economic forecasts. No one was watching. No one cared about markets at this hour. Daniel leaned back slightly, his shoulders pressing into the hard plastic. He remembered sitting in similar chairs decades earlier, though back then the hospital had been smaller, less polished, less efficient. He had been 16 the first time Elena collapsed from exhaustion after working 2 shifts in a garment factory. He had watched doctors move around her with quiet urgency, heard machines beep steadily, felt the first taste of helplessness settle into his chest. He had promised himself that night he would never allow the world to push her that far again. Life had a way of rearranging promises. The double doors opened suddenly, and a nurse stepped out holding a clipboard. Daniel stood immediately. "Mr. Russo?" "Yes. They're finishing the scan now." The doctor will speak with you shortly. How bad is it? He asked. The nurse offered the practiced neutrality of someone accustomed to difficult conversations. She's stable. That's a good sign. Stable. The word carried both comfort and uncertainty. Daniel nodded once and resumed pacing the length of the waiting room. His shoes made soft, measured sounds against the polished floor. A few minutes later, the doors opened again. A middle-aged physician in pale blue scrubs approached, glasses resting low on his nose as he reviewed a tablet. "Mr. Russo," the doctor said, extending his hand. "I'm Dr. Kaplan." Daniel shook it firmly. "She has a concussion," Kaplan continued, "some bruising along the side of the skull, likely from impact with the pavement. No intracranial bleeding. CT scan is clear." Daniel exhaled slowly. "She'll need monitoring overnight, possibly longer depending on how quickly her neurological responses stabilize." "Will she wake up?" "We expect so," Kaplan replied. "Her vitals are steady. She's strong for her age." Daniel almost smiled at that. Strong was an understatement when applied to Elena Russo. "Can I see her?" "In a few minutes. They're transferring her to a private room." Daniel nodded, then paused. "She was alone," he said quietly, "on the street." Kaplan looked at him carefully. "Unfortunately, that's not uncommon. People assume someone else will help." Daniel did not respond. Someone else. Those two words lingered. Kaplan gave a polite nod and walked back through the double doors, leaving Daniel once again alone with the muted television and the faint smell of disinfectant. He found himself thinking about Nina, her calm voice on the phone, her refusal of money, the simple statement she had made. People kept walking. He had spent years believing that power meant never needing help. Tonight, his mother had needed a stranger's kindness simply to remain visible. A nurse guided Daniel down the hallway 15 minutes later. The room assigned to Elena was quiet, softly lit by a small lamp near the window. Machines hummed gently, their monitors displaying stable green lines that rose and fell in reassuring rhythm. Elena lay beneath a white hospital blanket, her head slightly elevated. The bruise along her temple had darkened, a faint purple shadow beneath pale skin. A thin oxygen tube rested beneath her nose. Daniel pulled a chair close to the bed. "Ma," he said quietly. Her eyelids fluttered faintly but did not open. He sat there, studying the familiar lines of her face, noticing details he had overlooked during quicker visits in recent years. The faint crease between her brows when she worried, the silver strands of hair she refused to dye, the small scar near her chin from a childhood fall she had once described to him in great detail. He remembered the smell of tomato sauce simmering on Sundays, the sound of jazz playing softly on an old radio, the way she insisted on leaving the apartment door unlocked when he was young so neighbors could come in without knocking. Community was not a concept Elena discussed academically. It was something she lived. A quiet knock interrupted his thoughts. Daniel turned to see Elena's attending nurse, a woman in her 50s with warm eyes and the steady demeanor of someone who had seen nearly every version of human fear. "She's resting comfortably," the nurse said softly. "We'll monitor her overnight." Daniel nodded. "She was lucky," the nurse added. "If that woman hadn't stayed with her, exposure alone could have made things worse." Daniel glanced back at his mother. "Yes," he said quietly. "She was lucky." The nurse adjusted the IV line, then hesitated. "The woman who called," she said. "She waited longer than most people would have." Daniel considered that. "People used to wait," he replied. The nurse smiled faintly. "Some still do." After she left, Daniel remained seated beside the bed, watching the slow rise and fall of his mother's breathing. At 2:17 a.m., Elena stirred again. Her fingers twitched slightly against the blanket. Daniel leaned forward immediately. "Ma?" Her eyelids opened slowly, unfocused at first, then narrowing slightly as awareness returned in fragments. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice thin but unmistakable. "I'm here." Her gaze moved slowly across the room, confusion flickering briefly before settling. "What happened?" "You fell," he said gently. "You hit your head." She frowned faintly, as if irritated more by the inconvenience than the injury. "I told you that streetlight outside the pharmacy needed replacing," she murmured. Daniel let out a quiet breath that was almost laughter. You remember the streetlight? I remember everything, she replied weakly. Her eyes studied his face carefully. You look worried. You scared me. Elena's hand moved slowly across the blanket until it found his. You were always easy to scare, she said softly. Daniel shook his head slightly. Someone stayed with you, he said. A woman named Nina. Elena's expression shifted, memory returning gradually. Yes, she said. Warm hands. Daniel looked down briefly. She refused money. Elena's lips curved faintly. Good, she whispered. Her eyes drifted closed again, but her hand remained loosely wrapped around his. After several minutes, Daniel stepped into the hallway to make a call. Find her, he told Carlo quietly when the line connected. Who? The woman who called tonight. Nina Carter. There was a pause. You want a background check? I want to know if she got home safe. Carlo hesitated only briefly. Yes, boss. Daniel ended the call and returned to the chair beside his mother's bed. The city outside the window was quieter now, the rain reduced to a fine mist that softened the edges of buildings in the early morning darkness. For years, Daniel Russo had believed loyalty was built. Tonight, a stranger had shown him a different version, and something about that difference unsettled him more than any rival ever had. Daniel left the hospital just before sunrise, though the sky over Manhattan remained the dull gray color that comes when night and morning have not yet decided which one deserves the day. The rain had slowed to a fine mist, clinging to the pavement in a thin, reflective sheen. Traffic was lighter now, taxis moving slower, delivery trucks idling beside half-lit storefronts as bakers and grocers prepared for the rhythm of another day. He did not go home. Instead, the SUV carried him downtown to a narrow office building on Mulberry Street that looked unremarkable to anyone who passed it. The brass directory in the lobby listed a financial consulting firm on the 4th floor, a legal archive service on the 3rd, and a closed import business on the 2nd. None of those names mattered. Daniel's office occupied the top floor. The hallway lights turned on automatically as he stepped out of the elevator. The quiet inside felt different from the hospital, not sterile, but deliberate, controlled silence. Everything in the room reflected order. The dark oak desk polished to a soft shine. The neatly arranged folders stacked with geometric precision, the framed black and white photograph of Arthur Avenue in 1987 hanging opposite the window. Daniel removed his coat and draped it carefully over the back of his chair. Carlo was already there, standing near the window with a tablet in hand. You should be resting, Carlo said. Daniel ignored the comment. Did you find her? Carlo nodded once and stepped forward. Nina Carter. 29. Lives in the Bronx. 2-bedroom apartment. 3rd floor walk-up. No criminal record. No outstanding debt besides a small overdue utility payment. Works 3 jobs. Cleaning service on the Upper East Side. Night janitorial contract in Midtown twice a week. Weekend caregiver for an elderly woman in Riverdale. Daniel listened without interrupting. She supports her younger brother. Carlo continued. Marcus Carter, 14, good student, mechanical aptitude. School attendance record nearly perfect. Teachers describe him as quiet, but reliable. Daniel leaned back slightly, absorbing the information. Anyone bothering them? Carlo hesitated. Landlord filed a late rent notice last month. No eviction action yet. Daniel nodded slowly. And last night? He asked. She walked home from the Upper East Side, takes the long route to avoid subway fare. Weather records show heavy rain between 11 and midnight. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly at that detail. She gave her coat to your mother, Carlo added. I know. Silence settled briefly. Carlo studied him carefully. You want me to send something? Daniel looked toward the window. The city below had begun to brighten faintly as morning traffic increased. No, Daniel said. Not yet. Carlo waited. Daniel turned slightly. People who expect money stop seeing value in anything else. Carlo nodded, understanding the instruction. Daniel picked up a folder from his desk, then set it down again without opening it. She said people walked past. Daniel said quietly. Carlo did not answer immediately. They usually do, he said finally. Daniel leaned forward, resting both hands on the desk. That used to bother me, he said. What changed? I got busy. Carlo said nothing. Daniel stood and walked toward the window. The glass reflected his face faintly, the early light revealing the fatigue beneath his calm expression. My mother used to know everyone on our block, Daniel said. Name, birthday, what kind of soup they liked when they were sick. Carlo allowed a small smile. She still sends food to half the neighborhood. Daniel nodded slightly. She doesn't believe strangers exist, he said. That's rare now. Yes? Daniel turned back toward the desk. Arrange for the landlord's repair requests to be completed, Daniel said. Heating, plumbing, electrical, quietly. Use the building maintenance fund. Carlo nodded, already noting the instruction. And the boy, Daniel added. Marcus? Daniel nodded. Make sure his school has what it needs. Tools, materials, whatever program supports mechanical training. Anonymous donation. Carlo hesitated slightly. She might refuse direct help. That's why she won't see it, Daniel replied. Carlo allowed himself a brief approving glance. Daniel picked up his coat again. I'll be back at the hospital by noon. Carlo moved toward the door, then paused. You planning to meet her again? Daniel did not answer immediately. I don't know, he said finally. But even as he said it, he knew he would. Across the city, Nina Carter stood inside a narrow apartment kitchen, stirring a small pot of oatmeal while the morning news murmured softly from a cracked tablet propped against the wall. Marcus sat at the small table, textbooks open beside a mug of cheap coffee. You look tired, Marcus said. Long night, Nina replied. You working late again? No. She did not elaborate. The kitchen smelled faintly of cinnamon and old wood. The cabinets had been painted white years earlier, though the paint had begun to peel near the handles. The radiator hissed intermittently, fighting the lingering damp chill left by the night's rain. Marcus studied her face carefully. You okay? I helped someone last night, Nina said. Marcus raised an eyebrow. That usually means trouble. Not this time. He nodded slowly. I hope so. She placed the bowl in front of him. Eat. Marcus took a spoonful, then glanced up again. You sure you're all right? Nina hesitated. I found a woman on the street. Marcus lowered the spoon. Was she hurt? Yes. She okay? I think she will be. Marcus nodded once. You stayed with her. Nina gave him a look. You already know the answer. He smiled faintly. Grandma raised you right. Nina allowed a small breath of laughter. Later that afternoon, the building superintendent knocked on the apartment door. Repairs, he announced. Nina frowned slightly. Repairs? Orders came in this morning. Heating inspection, plumbing check. She stepped aside, confused but grateful as two maintenance workers began examining the radiator valves. Marcus glanced toward her with curiosity. You call someone? No. The workers moved efficiently, replacing worn seals and tightening loose fixtures with professional speed. By the time they finished, the apartment felt warmer, safer, more stable. Nina stood by the window after they left, watching traffic move along the avenue below. She did not yet know why things had changed, but she knew change rarely arrived without reason. Back at Mount Sinai, Daniel entered Elena's hospital room carrying a small paper bag from a bakery on Lexington Avenue. Inside were two things Elena always insisted made difficult days easier: warm bread and black coffee. Elena looked stronger than she had that morning. Pale, but alert. You look like you didn't sleep, she observed. Daniel placed the bag on the bedside table. I worked. She gave him a knowing look. You worried? Yes. Elena sipped the coffee slowly. The woman who helped me, she said. Did you thank her properly? Daniel hesitated briefly. I thanked her. That's not what I asked. Daniel almost smiled. She didn't want money. Elena nodded approvingly. Good. She works 3 jobs. Elena shook her head gently. This country forgets who keeps it clean. Daniel leaned back slightly in the chair. I made sure her apartment repairs were handled. Elena studied him carefully. Kindness that hides is still kindness, she said softly. Daniel looked at his hands. I don't know why this feels different. Elena reached across the small distance between them and touched his wrist lightly. Because she did something for you that money cannot buy. Daniel met her eyes. She stayed. Elena nodded. People remember who stays. The hospital room remained quiet except for the steady rhythm of the heart monitor. And for the first time in many years, Daniel Russo felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. Not obligation, not strategy. Something quieter, something older. Something that sounded very much like responsibility. The rain had stopped sometime before dawn, leaving the city washed in the kind of pale gray light that softened sharp edges but revealed imperfections. By late afternoon, the sidewalks of the Bronx had returned to their usual rhythm, delivery trucks idling beside corner delis, children's voices echoing faintly between apartment buildings, and the distant metallic roar of the subway running beneath the streets like an aging heartbeat that refused to stop. Nina Carter finished scrubbing the marble countertop in a penthouse apartment overlooking Central Park, just as the homeowner's dog began barking at the vacuum cleaner. The place smelled faintly of lemon disinfectant and expensive candles that probably cost more than her weekly grocery bill. She moved carefully through the wide living room, returning each decorative object exactly where she had found it. People who paid well tended to notice small changes. She did not resent the work. She never had. Work meant control. Control meant stability. Stability meant Marcus stayed in school. Those were the rules. As she gathered her supplies, her phone buzzed quietly in her pocket. The screen displayed an unknown number. For a moment, she considered ignoring it. Unknown numbers rarely brought good news when you lived paycheck to paycheck. But the vibration continued. She answered. Hello? Silence lingered for a fraction longer than expected. Then a familiar voice spoke. This is Daniel Russo. Nina did not answer immediately. She glanced toward the tall windows overlooking the park, watching the reflection of passing clouds glide slowly across the glass. I hope I'm not interrupting your work, Daniel continued. You're not, she replied carefully. Is your mother all right? She's recovering. A quiet breath escaped her before she realized she had been holding it. That's good. She asked about you. Nina shifted her weight slightly, adjusting the strap of her bag on her shoulder. You don't need to call me for that, she said gently. I didn't call for gratitude, Daniel replied. That caught her attention. Then why did you call? A brief pause. I wanted to make sure you got home safely. Nina looked down at the polished hardwood floor beneath her shoes. I did. I'm glad. She sensed something else in his tone, something cautious, almost unfamiliar to a man accustomed to control. You don't usually call strangers, she said. No, Daniel admitted. Silence settled between them. Not uncomfortable, but thoughtful. I didn't do anything special, Nina added finally. You stayed, Daniel replied. That's what people are supposed to do. Daniel's voice softened slightly. They don't. Nina had no response for that. I hope your brother is well, Daniel continued. Her eyes sharpened slightly. How do you know I have a brother? I make it my business to know who I owe, Daniel said simply. The honesty of the statement surprised her more than the information itself. Marcus appeared in the doorway of the penthouse kitchen just then, finishing his homework on the small folding chair she kept near the wall. Ready? He asked. Almost, she replied, covering the phone briefly. You don't need to worry about us, she said once she returned her attention to the call. I'm not worried, Daniel said. Then what are you? Another pause. Grateful, he answered. The word felt heavier than she expected. I should get back to work, Nina said. Yes, Daniel replied. Of course. The line disconnected quietly. Nina slipped the phone back into her pocket. Her thoughts unsettled in ways she could not fully explain. Gratitude was simple in theory. In practice, it often complicated things. That evening, Marcus sat at the small kitchen table dismantling an old carburetor he had found at a salvage yard. Mechanical parts spread across newspaper pages like pieces of a puzzle waiting for patience. You look distracted, he said without looking up. I got a call, Nina replied, stirring a pot of vegetable soup. Marcus raised an eyebrow. Good call? Complicated call. That sounds expensive. Nina smiled faintly. Not everything expensive costs money. Marcus considered that. Was it the family from last night? Yes. They okay? She's recovering. Marcus nodded approvingly. Good. The radiator clicked quietly as heat moved through the pipes, warming the apartment in small, uneven waves. Later, as Marcus returned to studying, Nina stood near the window, watching headlights sweep slowly across the wet pavement below. She did not trust sudden kindness. Life had taught her that gifts rarely arrived without expectation. But something about Daniel's voice did not sound transactional. It sounded uncertain. Elsewhere, Daniel sat in the back office of a quiet restaurant in Little Italy, a half-finished espresso cooling on the table beside him. Across from him sat Victor Salazar. Victor was older, his hair graying at the temples, his eyes always calculating angles others failed to notice. He had built influence through patience rather than force, though both men understood patience could be as dangerous as violence when used correctly. "I hear you left a meeting unfinished," Victor said casually. Daniel did not respond immediately. "Family emergency," he said finally. Victor nodded slowly, studying him carefully. "Family makes men predictable," Victor observed. Daniel leaned back in his chair. "Predictable men live longer," he replied. Victor smiled faintly. "I also hear you're spending time solving problems outside your usual interests." Daniel's gaze remained steady. "Problems are problems." Victor tapped the table lightly with one finger. "Kindness is admirable," he said, "but it can also be misinterpreted." Daniel took a slow sip of espresso. "Everything can be misinterpreted." Victor leaned forward slightly. "The city watches powerful men closely when they change habits." Daniel set the cup down gently. "I haven't changed habits." Victor's smile did not reach his eyes. "Perhaps not," he said. "But people notice when wolves pause before they bite." Daniel met his gaze calmly. "Maybe the wolf is deciding what deserves teeth." Victor studied him in silence before nodding slowly. "Careful decisions build long legacies," Daniel stood. "So do careful alliances." As Daniel left the restaurant, the cool evening air carried the scent of roasted chestnuts from a nearby street vendor. The familiar sounds of conversation drifted from open windows above the narrow street. His phone vibrated again. A message from Carlo. "Repairs completed. Landlord satisfied. No suspicion." Daniel typed a short reply. "Good." Then he added another instruction. "Check school workshop funding programs." The reply came quickly. Already in motion, Daniel slipped the phone back into his coat pocket and continued walking. Across the city, Nina washed dishes in the narrow sink, steam fogging the window above her hands. Marcus explained a design idea for rebuilding the carburetor into a functioning model. "You think anyone would pay for something like this?" Marcus asked. "People pay for skill," Nina replied. Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "Then I'll build something worth paying for." Nina smiled faintly. That's how this country was supposed to work. Later that night, after Marcus had gone to bed, Nina opened the small notebook she kept in her dresser drawer. Inside were lists, bills, schedules, reminders, small goals that kept life moving forward. She hesitated, then wrote a new line. "Some people still stop." She closed the notebook carefully and turned off the light. Across the river, Daniel stood by the window of his office overlooking the city skyline. Power had always been about anticipation, predicting threats, controlling variables, but the appearance of Nina Carter in his life had introduced something he had not accounted for: unrequested loyalty. And loyalty freely given carried obligations that money alone could never settle. 3 days after the night on Tremont Avenue, the city had already begun to forget. New York always forgot quickly. Sirens became background noise. Headlines replaced yesterday's tragedies with new ones. Pavement washed clean beneath passing rain, erasing the evidence of fear, mercy, indifference, and chance. But some people did not forget. Daniel Russo stood at the window of his office just after sunset, watching the slow movement of traffic along the East River. The sky was clear now, streaked with the fading gold of late autumn light, the kind that made the city look almost forgiving. Behind him, Carlo placed a thin folder on the desk. "You asked for details on the redevelopment project from 15 years ago," Carlo said. Daniel did not turn immediately. "Leave it," he replied. Carlo hesitated. "That area includes several blocks near where Nina lives." Daniel nodded slightly, still looking out over the water. "I know." After Carlo left, Daniel opened the folder slowly. Inside were maps, acquisition records, construction permits, and financial projections from a period of his life he rarely revisited. Back then, the city had been recovering from recession. Investors wanted opportunity. Neighborhoods that had once been considered forgotten suddenly became valuable. Daniel had built part of his fortune there. He turned the pages carefully. The redevelopment plan had displaced hundreds of tenants over 2 years. Legally, efficiently, profitably. He remembered the arguments he had made at the time. Progress required sacrifice. Modernization created opportunity. Markets rewarded risk. He had believed those things. He still believed some of them, but belief did not prevent consequences. A small handwritten note clipped to the file caught his attention. It had been added recently. Carter residence, previous tenant listing. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly. He closed the folder without finishing the page. Across the city, Nina was finishing her evening shift in a midtown office building, her mop moving in steady rhythm across polished tile floors that reflected rows of fluorescent lights. The cleaning crew had mostly left already, their laughter echoing faintly down the hallway as they gathered coats and bags. Nina preferred working alone. Silence allowed thinking. Thinking allowed planning. Planning allowed survival. She rinsed the mop bucket carefully, ensuring no residue remained that might lead to complaints. Complaints meant replacement. Replacement meant instability. Her phone buzzed once in her pocket. She ignored it until the task was finished. When she finally checked the screen, she saw an email notification from Marcus's school. Subject: workshop equipment donation. She frowned slightly and opened the message. The school administration expressed appreciation for an anonymous contribution that would allow expansion of the mechanical training program. New equipment would be installed before the end of the month. Marcus had mentioned that program weeks earlier. She had told him they could not afford the additional materials required. Now the school could. Nina stared at the message for a long moment before closing the phone. She did not need confirmation. She understood patterns. Generosity rarely moved without direction. Later that night, Marcus spread a set of small mechanical tools across the kitchen table, his excitement visible in the quick movement of his hands. "They're adding engine modules," he said. "Real ones, not plastic training pieces." Nina stirred a pot of lentil soup slowly. "That's good." Marcus glanced at her. "You don't sound surprised." "I'm learning not to be surprised," she replied. Marcus leaned back slightly. "You think this has something to do with that man?" Nina did not answer immediately. "I think life sometimes tests whether people mean what they say," she said finally. Marcus nodded slowly. "Think he means it?" "I don't know yet." The radiator hummed softly, filling the apartment with uneven warmth. Marcus studied the mechanical diagram in front of him. "You always say people don't give without wanting something. That's usually true. So what does he want?" Nina looked at her brother carefully. "Maybe to feel like he owes less to the world." Marcus considered that quietly. "That sounds heavy." "It usually is." Meanwhile, Daniel sat beside Elena's hospital bed as she slowly regained strength. She had insisted on real coffee instead of the weak version served on hospital trays. The nurse had reluctantly agreed. "You look tired," Elena observed, her voice stronger now, though still softened by fatigue. "I've looked worse." Elena smiled faintly. "Who is she?" Daniel leaned back slightly in the chair. "Nina Carter, the woman who stayed." "Yes." Elena stirred her coffee slowly. "She has kind eyes." "You barely saw her." "I saw enough." Daniel studied the floor briefly. "She works 3 jobs." Elena nodded as if that confirmed something she already suspected. "America still runs on invisible people," she said quietly. Daniel did not disagree. "She refused money." Elena smiled again. "That's why you respect her." Daniel met his mother's gaze. "She lost her home years ago. Redevelopment project." Elena's expression shifted slightly. "And you were involved." It was not a question. "Yes." Elena sighed softly. "Progress always arrives, dressed like opportunity," she said. Daniel leaned forward slightly. "I didn't know her then." "You don't need to know someone to affect their life." Her voice was not accusatory. It was simply true. Daniel rested his hands together thoughtfully. "She hasn't asked for anything." Elena nodded. "That makes the debt harder." Daniel almost smiled. You always taught me to pay debts. I taught you to understand them first. Silence settled between them, comfortable but thoughtful. You could have moved me years ago, Elena added after a moment. I tried. You tried to convince me with comfort. Daniel tilted his head slightly. What should I have used? Time, she replied. You stopped having enough of that. Daniel looked at his watch instinctively, then shook his head faintly. You're going home tomorrow, he said. Elena nodded approvingly. And you will invite her to visit. Daniel hesitated. She may refuse. Elena smiled knowingly. Then invite her properly. Daniel raised an eyebrow. What does that mean? It means you ask without power, she replied. Just a man asking another person for time. Daniel exhaled slowly. That was more difficult than negotiating contracts. Later that evening, Daniel stood once more in his office overlooking the dark river. The city lights shimmered across the water, reflections breaking apart with each passing current. Carlo entered quietly. There's been movement, he said. Daniel turned. Victor? Carlo nodded. He's asking questions about your recent interests. Daniel remained calm. He's curious. He's cautious. Daniel walked back toward the desk slowly. Curiosity is not a crime. Carlo's expression remained neutral. In our world, curiosity often becomes leverage. Daniel nodded slightly. Then let him wonder. Carlo hesitated. You want distance from this situation? Daniel considered the question. No, he said finally. Then we prepare. Daniel rested his hands on the back of the chair. I am prepared. Carlo studied him carefully. Prepared for what? Daniel's voice remained quiet. For the possibility that not everything valuable can be measured in control. Carlo gave a small nod, though uncertainty flickered briefly in his expression. After he left, Daniel picked up his phone and opened a blank contact message. He did not type immediately. The cursor blinked steadily on the screen. For years, communication had been transactional, efficient, directed toward outcomes. Now he found himself considering something unfamiliar. How to ask without demanding. How to offer without obligating. How to acknowledge a connection that had not been negotiated. Across the river, Nina closed the small notebook beside her bed. Inside, another new line had appeared beneath the last entry. Some debts cannot be paid with money. She turned off the lamp and listened to the quiet hum of the radiator, the distant sound of traffic filtering through the thin apartment walls. Life remained uncertain. But uncertainty did not always mean danger. Sometimes it meant change was approaching quietly, waiting to see who would notice first. The message remained unsent for nearly 12 hours. Daniel Russo was not a man who struggled to choose words. Words were tools, like contracts or leverage or silence. He understood how to construct sentences that moved people toward decisions they believed were their own. But this message required something else. It required restraint. Late afternoon sunlight filtered through the tall windows of his office, casting long shadows across the dark wood floor. The city below moved with its usual rhythm, taxis pressing forward impatiently, pedestrians weaving between crosswalks, construction crews guiding cranes into position with practiced signals. Daniel sat behind his desk, phone resting face up beside a leather-bound ledger he had not opened. Carlo knocked once before entering. You asked for an update, he said. Daniel nodded. Nina Carter's landlord confirmed maintenance orders were received through the city repair grant program. Carlo continued. No suspicion. Heating system stabilized. Plumbing replaced. Daniel acknowledged the information with a slight tilt of his head. And the school? He asked. Workshop expansion approved. Equipment delivery scheduled next week. Daniel allowed himself a small exhale. Carlo watched him carefully. You're investing a lot of attention, Carlo said. Daniel leaned back slightly. Attention is not always investment. In our world, it usually is. Daniel folded his hands calmly. She did not ask for anything. Carlo nodded once. That makes her different. Daniel's gaze shifted briefly toward the window. It makes her honest. Carlo hesitated, then added carefully, Victor is still asking questions. Daniel did not react outwardly. What kind of questions? Why you are directing resources outside existing structures? Daniel stood slowly and walked toward the window, the skyline reflecting faintly across the glass. Victor believes everything is a transaction, Daniel said quietly. Carlo allowed a faint smile. He survived by believing that. Daniel nodded slightly. That does not make him correct. Carlo said nothing further. Across the river in the Bronx, Nina stepped carefully down the narrow staircase outside her apartment building. Her coat pulled tightly against the sharp chill of early evening. Marcus followed behind her, balancing a small cardboard box filled with spare metal parts he had collected from the school workshop. "You sure we don't need a taxi?" Marcus asked. "We're not made of taxi money," Nina replied. Marcus grinned slightly. "Worth asking." They walked 2 blocks to the small grocery store on the corner where prices were low and the produce was sometimes better than expected if one arrived early enough. Inside, the familiar scent of oranges and fresh bread lingered in the air. Mrs. Alvarez, the store owner, greeted Nina warmly. "You look less tired this week," she observed. "I feel less tired," Nina replied. "That's a blessing." Nina selected a loaf of bread and a small bag of apples. Marcus lingered near a display of motor magazines. "You saving for that repair manual?" Nina asked. "Almost," Marcus replied. Mrs. Alvarez leaned closer. "Someone paid the balance on your account this morning," she said quietly. Nina paused. "My account?" Mrs. Alvarez nodded. "All of it." Nina felt a tightening in her chest that had nothing to do with gratitude. "How?" she asked. The older woman shrugged. "Online payment. No name." Marcus looked at Nina. "That your friend?" Nina did not answer immediately. She paid for the groceries and stepped back into the cool evening air, her thoughts moving carefully. Kindness had weight. Weight carried responsibility. Later that evening, Daniel drove alone to the Bronx for the first time in years. He did not bring security. He did not bring Carlo. He parked 2 blocks away from Nina's apartment and walked the rest of the distance, hands in his coat pockets, observing the neighborhood in a way he had not allowed himself to do in a long time. Children played near the curb despite the cold. A mechanic leaned beneath the hood of an aging sedan while music played softly from a radio balanced on the windshield. A woman watered plants in small pots arranged carefully along a narrow fire escape. Life continued in quiet resilience. Daniel stopped briefly beside a small tree planted unevenly in the sidewalk, its leaves nearly gone for the season. He remembered similar streets from his own childhood. Different names, same rhythm, same quiet determination. He did not approach Nina's building, not yet. Instead, he continued walking until he reached the small church on the corner, its doors open for evening prayer. The faint sound of an organ drifted into the street, accompanied by the soft murmur of voices speaking in low, respectful tones. Daniel stood there longer than he expected. He had not entered a church in many years. Faith, like trust, required a kind of vulnerability he had learned to avoid. But tonight, the open door felt symbolic. Some places existed to remind people who they were before the world convinced them to become something else. Across town, Nina washed dishes slowly, her mind unsettled. Marcus studied engine diagrams beside her, pencil moving steadily across lined paper. "You look like you're solving a problem," he observed. "I am," Nina replied. "Good problem or bad problem?" "I don't know yet," Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "Problems that start with people usually take longer to fix." Nina smiled faintly. "That might be the smartest thing you've said all week." He shrugged. "I read a lot." Later, as Marcus slept, Nina opened her notebook again. She reread the lines she had written over the past days. "Some people still stop. Some debts cannot be paid with money." She added another. "Kindness can feel like risk." She paused before closing the notebook. Because risk meant uncertainty, uncertainty meant vulnerability, and vulnerability had never protected anyone she loved. Meanwhile, Daniel returned to his office long after dark. Carlo looked up from the desk as Daniel entered. "You were out," Carlo observed. Daniel removed his coat calmly. "Yes." Carlo waited. Daniel poured himself a glass of water and remained silent for several seconds. "Do you believe people can change?" Daniel asked finally. Carlo considered the question carefully. "I believe people reveal different sides depending on what they fear losing." Daniel nodded slowly. "And what do I fear losing?" Carlo allowed himself a small, respectful smile. "That depends on what you believe you owe." Daniel set the glass down. He picked up his phone once more and opened the message window. This time, he typed, "I would like to speak with you in person. No obligation. Only conversation." He stared at the sentence for a long moment. Then, he pressed send. Across the Bronx, Nina's phone vibrated softly on the nightstand beside her bed. She did not reach for it immediately. But she did not ignore it either. Some moments asked questions long before answers were ready. And both of them, in different parts of the same restless city, were beginning to understand that the night on Tremont Avenue had created a connection neither power nor poverty could easily define, the kind of connection that did not demand attention. Only honesty. Nina did not answer the message immediately. The phone rested quietly on the nightstand, while the soft hum of the radiator filled the small bedroom with uneven warmth. Outside, the distant sound of traffic drifted through the thin window glass, reminding her that the city never truly slept, it only changed pace. She lay awake longer than usual, staring at the faint shadows moving across the ceiling as headlights passed below. "I would like to speak with you in person. No obligation, only conversation." The words were simple, careful, almost unfamiliar, coming from a man whose name carried weight in places most people never saw. Nina had learned early in life that simple words could carry complicated consequences. By morning, the message still remained unanswered. Routine helped her think. Routine created space between emotion and decision. She prepared breakfast for Marcus: eggs, toast, and coffee strong enough to wake the kind of determination that did not depend on comfort. Marcus reviewed mechanical diagrams while eating, already thinking ahead to the new workshop equipment arriving at school. "You're quiet," he observed. "I'm thinking," Nina replied. "Thinking usually means change." "Sometimes." Marcus wiped his hands on a paper towel. "You trust him?" Nina considered the question carefully. "Trust isn't something you give," she said. "It's something you test." Marcus nodded slowly. "You meeting him?" "I might." Marcus leaned back in his chair. "Public place," he advised. Nina smiled faintly. "You sound older every week. Engines teach patience," Marcus replied. Later that afternoon, Nina sent a short response. "Public place. 1 hour." She did not add politeness or explanation. Clarity was safer. Daniel read the message while standing near the window of his office. He allowed himself the smallest nod. Respect often revealed itself through boundaries. He replied with a location in Brooklyn Heights, a cafe known more for conversation than attention. Quiet enough for privacy. Public enough for reassurance. The cafe sat on a corner overlooking a narrow tree-lined street where brownstones carried the weight of history in their brick facades. Inside, warm light reflected off wooden tables polished smooth by years of quiet meetings and unspoken agreements. Jazz played softly from hidden speakers, the steady rhythm creating space for careful thought. Daniel arrived early. He chose a table near the window where natural light softened the seriousness of the conversation he anticipated. He did not bring security inside. Outside, one car remained parked half a block away. Precaution was habit, but presence was choice. Nina entered precisely at the agreed time. She wore a simple dark coat, her hair pulled back neatly, posture steady but alert. She paused briefly near the entrance, scanning the room with the same careful awareness she had developed walking home late at night. Daniel stood as she approached. "Thank you for coming," he said. "You said no obligation," Nina replied calmly. They sat. A server approached, offering coffee. Nina ordered tea. Daniel chose espresso. Small decisions helped create normalcy. For a moment, neither spoke. Outside, a man walked his dog slowly past the window, leaves gathering near the curb in small restless clusters pushed by the wind. "I appreciate you agreeing to meet," Daniel began. Nina nodded slightly. "You helped my mother," he continued. "I wanted to thank you properly." "You already thanked me," she replied. "Gratitude can be repeated," Daniel said. She studied his expression carefully. "You didn't ask me here only to say thank you." "No." Honesty again. "What do you want from me?" Nina asked. Daniel did not respond immediately. The jazz music shifted to a slower tempo. the notes soft and reflective. "I want to understand something," he said finally. "Understanding is rarely free," Nina replied. Daniel accepted the statement without objection. "When you found my mother," he said, "why did you stay?" Nina looked down briefly at her hands wrapped loosely around the warm ceramic cup. "Because someone should." "That's not an answer," Daniel said gently. "It's the only one I have." Daniel considered her carefully. "You knew who I was." "Yes." "You knew helping her could create complications." "Yes." "Yet you stayed." Nina met his gaze steadily. "When my mother died," she said quietly, "she collapsed on a sidewalk outside a grocery store. People walked around her because they thought someone else would help. By the time someone did, it was too late." Daniel did not interrupt. "I promised myself," she continued, "I would never be part of that kind of silence." The words settled between them. Quiet truth carried its own authority. Daniel nodded slowly. "You believe people are responsible for each other." "I believe we notice each other," Nina said. "Responsibility comes after that." Daniel allowed a faint expression of respect to surface. "You lost your home years ago," he said carefully. Nina's eyes sharpened slightly. "You investigated me." "I investigate everything," Daniel replied. "That doesn't make it right." "No," he agreed. The honesty surprised her again. "That project displaced many families," Nina said. "Yes, my family was one of them." "I know. And now you help repair my apartment." "I repaired the building," Daniel corrected. "You paid for it." "Yes." Nina studied him carefully. "Why?" Daniel considered the question longer this time. "Because progress without accountability becomes damage," he said quietly. "That sounds like something a lawyer would say." "I am not a lawyer." "No," Nina replied calmly. "You're not." A faint smile touched the corner of Daniel's mouth. "I am trying to correct something I cannot undo," he said. "You cannot correct everything." "I can attempt balance." Nina leaned back slightly. "Balance for who?" "For the part of me that still listens when my mother speaks." The simplicity of the answer shifted something in the air between them. Nina took a slow sip of tea. "My life is stable right now," she said carefully. "Stability matters more than opportunity." "I understand. I cannot owe you." "You do not." Silence settled again. People at nearby tables spoke quietly, unaware of the weight carried by the conversation unfolding beside them. "I am not asking for loyalty," Daniel added. "Good," Nina replied, "because loyalty cannot be purchased." "I know." Nina studied him one final time before nodding once. "Then, we understand each other." Daniel inclined his head slightly. "I believe we do." They finished their drinks without urgency. Outside, the late afternoon light softened into early evening, the sky turning the muted blue that always seemed to pause the city briefly before night resumed its rhythm. As they stood, Nina spoke again. "You cannot fix everything," she said. "No," Daniel replied. "But you can choose what you do next." Daniel nodded. "That is the only part anyone controls." Nina turned toward the door, then paused. "Your mother raised you well," she said. Daniel allowed a faint breath of acknowledgement. "She continues trying." Nina stepped out into the cool evening air. Daniel remained inside for a moment longer, watching the reflection of passing headlights glide across the cafe window. Power had always given him reach, but reach without purpose created distance. For the first time in many years, he felt the beginning of something unfamiliar forming quietly beneath the structure of his carefully controlled life. Not redemption, not yet, but direction. 3 months later, winter had begun loosening its grip on the city, though the mornings still carried a chill sharp enough to remind people that change rarely arrived all at once. Patches of snow lingered in the shadows of buildings, slowly surrendering to the thin sunlight stretching longer across the sidewalks each day. On a quiet Sunday afternoon, the kitchen in Elena Russo's townhouse smelled of rosemary, roasted chicken, and warm bread. Elena insisted on cooking the first full meal herself since leaving the hospital, despite Daniel's suggestion that a professional chef could easily manage the preparation. She waved off the idea with the same stubborn authority that had shaped most of Daniel's childhood decisions. "If strangers cook," she had said firmly, "strangers eat. Family eats what is made with memory." Daniel stood near the window watching the late afternoon light fall across the polished dining table. The room felt different than it had before the accident. Less formal, less guarded. The heavy curtains were open now, allowing sunlight to warm the dark wood floors. A small jazz record played softly in the background, its steady rhythm blending with the quiet sounds of preparation. The doorbell rang. Daniel glanced toward his mother. "You invited her," Elena said calmly without looking up from the cutting board. "I invited them," Daniel corrected. "Good," Elena replied. Daniel opened the door to find Nina standing beside Marcus, both dressed simply but carefully. Marcus held a small box wrapped in plain brown paper, his posture respectful but curious as he observed the details of the home. "Thank you for coming," Daniel said. Nina nodded once. "Your mother insisted," she replied. "That sounds like her." Marcus extended the small package. "My sister says it's polite not to arrive empty-handed." Daniel accepted the box. "That is correct." Inside the paper wrapping rested a small metal object, an antique carburetor component Marcus had restored himself, polished carefully until its original craftsmanship became visible again. "I like fixing things," Marcus said quietly. Daniel examined the piece with genuine interest. "This was made well," he observed. "Things built well last longer," Marcus replied. Elena appeared in the hallway just then, her posture steady, her expression warm but observant. "So this is the young engineer," she said. Marcus smiled politely. "I'm still learning." "That never stops," Elena replied. She embraced Nina gently, the gesture natural and unforced. "You gave me your coat," Elena said softly. Nina seemed slightly uncomfortable with the attention. "It was just a coat." "No," Elena said. "It was presents." They moved to the dining table, where simple dishes had been arranged with care rather than extravagance. Roast chicken, potatoes seasoned with olive oil and herbs, green beans sautéed lightly with garlic, and fresh bread still warm from the oven. The meal felt familiar in a way none of them had expected. Conversation began cautiously but gradually found rhythm. Marcus spoke about the new workshop equipment at school and his interest in rebuilding engines from discarded parts. Elena listened attentively, occasionally asking questions that revealed genuine curiosity rather than polite obligation. Daniel observed quietly, recognizing something rare unfolding, people speaking without calculation. "I grew up near Arthur Avenue," Elena said during the meal. "People there believed skill was a form of dignity." Marcus nodded. "My teacher says the same thing." Daniel poured water into Nina's glass. "You manage 3 jobs," Elena observed gently. "For now," Nina replied. "And yet, you still found time to help a stranger." Nina met her gaze calmly. "No one is a stranger when they need help." Elena smiled faintly. "That is how communities survive." After dinner, Marcus examined a small collection of antique tools Daniel had inherited but never used. His enthusiasm was quiet but unmistakable. "These were handcrafted," Marcus said, studying the worn handles. "They belonged to my father," Daniel explained. Marcus handled the tools carefully, as if aware they represented more than metal and wood. "They should be used," Marcus said. Daniel nodded slowly. "Yes," he agreed. Later, as evening settled, and the city lights began flickering on outside the tall windows, Nina stood near the doorway preparing to leave. "You didn't need to do all this," she said. Elena waved the comment aside. "Kindness is not a transaction," she replied. Daniel stepped forward. "The workshop program you mentioned," he said carefully to Marcus. "There is an apprenticeship opportunity opening this summer." Marcus glanced at Nina instinctively. "Only if you want it," Daniel added quickly. Nina appreciated the phrasing. Choice mattered. Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "I'd like to earn it," he said. "That is the only way it has value," Daniel replied. As Nina prepared to leave, Elena touched her hand gently. "You changed something important," Elena said quietly. Nina shook her head. "I just made a phone call." Elena smiled knowingly. "No," she replied softly. "You made a decision." Outside, the air carried the scent of early spring, faint but present beneath the lingering cold. Streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement as Nina and Marcus walked toward the subway entrance. "You trust him now?" Marcus asked. Nina considered the question carefully. "I trust actions more than promises," she said. Marcus nodded. "Feels like he's trying." "Yes," Nina replied. "Trying matters." Across the street, Daniel watched from the window as they disappeared into the movement of the city. Elena joined him quietly. "You cannot rewrite the past," she said. "I know." but you can influence what happens next. Daniel studied the reflection of the city lights in the glass. I used to think power meant controlling outcomes. And now? Now I think it means accepting responsibility for them. Elena nodded approvingly. That lesson took you long enough. Daniel allowed a faint smile. Some lessons require the right teacher. The jazz record ended softly in the background. For the first time in many years, the house felt less like a fortress and more like a place where voices belonged. Across the city, Nina opened her notebook once more before sleep. Beneath the previous lines, she added a final thought. Justice is not always loud. Sometimes it begins with noticing who is still lying on the sidewalk. And sometimes, when someone chooses not to walk past, the direction of many lives begins to change quietly, without announcement, without spectacle, but with a permanence that cannot easily be undone. The city continued moving outside her window, but something within it had shifted slightly. Not enough for headlines, not enough for recognition, just enough for meaning. The story reminds us that justice does not always begin in courtrooms or positions of power. Sometimes it begins in the quiet decision of one person choosing not to walk away. True character is revealed not by wealth, status, or influence, but by the willingness to recognize the dignity of another human being, especially when no reward is guaranteed. Kindness, when given freely, has the power to awaken conscience, challenge past mistakes, and create unexpected paths toward redemption. The lesson is simple yet profound. The world changes not only through grand actions, but through ordinary moments when someone decides to stop, to care, and to take responsibility for another person's humanity.